You've been playing fantasy football wrong. Don't worry, your whole league's been playing it wrong too. But it's okay. Hang around and I'll show you how to play real fantasy football on the Fantasy First Down. So you won your fantasy league. You must know everything about football. Among your mates, you are the king of the NFL. Newsflash. Quick math time. Here's a football field. There's your fantasy team, all 6 of them. What do you notice though? There's 22 people on the field. So what do we do with those other 16 players? Well, we don't really care about the O-lineman. There's nothing we can really talk about there. But there's that whole defense on the other side, and we're totally ignoring them. Well, kind of. Maybe your league's still in the dark ages and you play with kickers and DSTs. Did you know kickers and DSTs are the most random position in football? It has the least season-long variance and the most weekly variance among all positions, meaning that it's going to make a big difference to your fantasy leagues without requiring a great amount of skill. If you don't believe me, here's some numbers. Here are the top 10 fantasy finishes in DST according to Fantasy Pros last year. And you'll notice that the Dallas Cowboys finished on top, despite scoring -1 points in multiple weeks. In fact, they didn't get over 2 points in 6 different weeks. And yet, they're the top DST in the league. In fact, last season, in 7 weeks, they failed to outscore the worst DST team, the Washington Commanders. That's how random the DST position is. There is so little skill in picking best DST team. Now, I know what you're thinking. You want to get rid of DST because you suck at DST. No, not at all. I love DST. I've been a top 10 DST ranker 2 of the last 3 years on Fantasy Pros. And even I understand that there's a ridiculous amount of randomness, that winning your week with DST doesn't show your football understanding. That's just luck, baby. You need to get your fantasy football winner being the person who understands the most about football. And that means booting DST out the door. And while you're at it, probably kick kickers out as well. Shouldn't the winner of your fantasy league be the person with the most skill? Well, I've got a solution for you. IDP. IDP stands for individual defensive players. And here's how it works. We take those other 11 guys on the field and we include them in fantasy football, not just their team, but each of those individual players. And there's a heap of different ways you can do this, but it basically works the same way that standard fantasy football works. Every player gets points based on their output. Every tackle gives them points. Every sack gives them points. Intercepts, points. Fumble recoveries, points. Everything gives them points. It's exactly how fantasy football was meant to be run. But now you actually have to know something about all the football players on the field, not just the 6 offensive players on your fantasy team. So how do you incorporate IDP into your league? Well, it's a pretty simple system. The first thing you do is you remove DST and you replace it with any number of IDP positions you wish. You can do this in a number of different ways. You can either have a standard IDP position. You can have as many of these as you want, where you can include any defensive player and that player gets points based on their output. There's a bit of a problem with this though. In IDP, generally, linebackers will get the most points because they get most involved in the offense. They're tackling on most plays, plus they still give you some sack and interception output. For that reason, we need to mix things up a little bit. And just like with our offensive output, we don't put 6 standard flex positions in a football league. We break it down by position. So you can break it down in whatever way you want. Here's my recommendation. Generally, we split IDP into 3 positions. DL, which is, of course, the defensive lineman, LB, which is the linebackers, and DB, which is the defensive backs. And it's up to you how many of each of these positions you want. If you're still an IDP novice, it makes sense to maybe have one of each and possibly a flex spot as well, as you dip your toes in the water and get used to it. If you've been playing for a little bit longer, you probably want your team to look a lot more like its offensive counterpart. You've probably got about 7 or 8 offensive starters. It makes sense to have about 7 or 8 defensive starters as well. So most of the time you put in a couple of D lineman spots, a couple of linebackers, a couple of defensive backs, and maybe an IDP flex spot. If you're getting really advanced, then you can get a little bit more cute. We can break our defensive linemen up into defensive ends and defensive tackles. We can break our defensive backs up into cornerbacks and safeties. You can mix and match as much as you want. The more detail you get into, the more you're making sure that your league winner is actually the football expert at the end of the day. The problem is that every league is going to be a bit different, and it's up to you how you set yours up. You need to sort out your scoring settings. So generally, IDP players will get points based on a number of different outcomes. They get points for sacks, interceptions, tackles, also fumble recoveries and touchdowns, and a few smaller categories you can add in if you want. The biggest ones you need to worry about are tackles, sacks, and interceptions. How you score these outcomes is going to impact how each of those positions are valued. If you want your D linemen, in particular your defensive ends, to be valuable, you want to increase the point for a sack. Standard is usually about 5 points, but you can push it a little bit higher if you want. Linebackers get points for tackles. So the more tackles they get, the more points they're going to get. They get more tackles than any other position in football. So the higher you make a tackle worth, the more your linebackers are going to be valued. I would recommend about 1.5 points per tackle. If you go down toward 1 point per tackle, you're going to undervalue them a little bit. You can also decide whether they should get points for half tackles or not, assisted tackles essentially. Usually that would be half the amount of points they'd get for a tackle. Defensive backs are going to get increased output if you increase the value of an interception or, more commonly, a defended pass. Cornerbacks are really only going to be valuable, especially outside cornerbacks, if they're getting points for pass breakups. So you can really increase the value of a cornerback and, to a lesser extent, a safety if you increase the amount of points for a pass breakup. Here's my recommended settings to get you started. The reason I recommend these settings is very simple. This is the Fantasy Pros standard. I generally do all my rankings through the Fantasy Pros app so that I can go in the accuracy competition. I've been top 3 in IDP accuracy the last few years. And I recommend you check out my rankings at ffdfantasyfootball.com to find out exactly how you should be ranking these players and selecting them in your drafts. If you get your point settings like this, then you can use my rankings and you're going to have a foot up over the rest of your league. Regardless of what you do, just give it a go. Have fun with it. You've got nothing to lose and a whole lot to gain, because all of a sudden you're taking an interest in twice the amount of players on the football field, and that can only make fantasy football a whole lot more fun. Now, the question you should be asking yourselves is, how do I value these IDP players and when do I draft them? Well, it really depends on your league setup. If you've only got a couple of IDP slots, the IDP position is pretty deep. There's going to be multiple linebackers who are going to be good tackle producers in every team. And for that reason, unless you've got at least 3 or 4 IDP spots, you're probably going to be able to take them very late in the draft and get pretty solid output. The deeper you get into IDP and the more different positions you have, the more they increase in value. Generally, you want to take the linebackers first because ultimately that is still the least deep position. A lot of teams only play with one every down linebacker, and they're going to be the big tackle producers. There's going to be enough defensive ends and particularly enough defensive tackles on most teams that you can take them a little bit later. Safety and defensive back in general is a pretty deep position, and it tends to have a lot of randomness. As a general rule, we don't know exactly which teams are going to be thrown on a lot and therefore have to use their secondary a lot until we get a bit into the season. It is generally the weaker teams, but there is a lot of variability there. You get a lot more consistency out of your linebackers than you do out of your defensive backs. So for that reason, I generally draft my defensive backs last. I would recommend going linebackers first, then defensive linemen, and then your defensive backs. The real question is, how do you value these players compared to your offensive players? And that's where things get a little bit tricky. As a general rule, it depends on how many of each position you have. If you've got quite a few IDP players, as a general rule, I would start drafting them around the 8th or ninth round after you've filled out your offensive roster. Ultimately, it's a whole lot harder to get your hands on top offensive players than it is top defensive players. Plus, as a general rule, in most leagues, not everyone has a very good handle on where the correct IDP value is. So you'll probably be able to pick up some bargains later on in the draft. That's not going to happen in offensive leagues because it's so much easier to get news and to get accurate rankings on offensive positions. So for that reason, I generally fill out my offensive rosters. You generally see IDP players start going off the board around the 5th or 6th round. I would wait until at least the 8th or ninth round, and even then only if the value is right. You can probably start to fill out your offensive bench before you start to take any IDP players, even in a full IDP league, because of how deep the position is. So make sure you stay patient and get those bargains late on in drafts. And that's how you can take advantage of the extra knowledge you have about IDP compared to your league. So to check out my IDP rankings and all of my other rankings, make sure you go to our website, ffdfantasyfootball.com. You can also ask questions on Twitter at fantasyfirstdown with no O or Instagram at thefantasyfirstdown. Please make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. I also do a whole heap of YouTube and article stuff for Razzball, so please head over to Razzball. They've got a whole heap of really good tools that can help you in your fantasy football research. If you want more help with IDP, you can also check out the articles I've written for Razzball. You can find them on the article list on my website at ffdfantasyfootball.com. I take you through everything you could possibly need to know about setting up an IDP league. I'll be back in the next few days with my IDP rankings to help you work out which players you should actually be taking when. If you have any questions, as always, please make sure you hit us up on Twitter or Instagram, and make sure you like and subscribe on our YouTube channel. Welcome to the IDP Brotherhood.